Most people handle it completely wrong the moment an avoidant partner starts pulling away. Either they lash out and block them in a fit of anger, or they swing the opposite direction and start begging for attention and reassurance. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Both of those reactions lead to the exact same outcome. More distance, more confusion, more emotional power slipping through your fingers. That's because avoidant dynamics were never meant to be solved through emotional intensity in the first place. They get resolved through emotional control instead. And there's one particular response that completely shifts the emotional direction of the whole connection, yet almost nobody actually uses it correctly. Before we go any further, there's something crucial you need to understand. When an avoidant person pulls away, it doesn't automatically mean they've stopped caring about you. In a lot of cases, it actually means their emotions became too intense, too fast, or simply too overwhelming for their nervous system to process in that particular moment. So they step back, not to punish you, but to regain some sense of internal control. The real problem starts when the other person responds emotionally, with panic, with anger, or by chasing after them. That kind of reaction just restarts the same tired cycle all over again. One person retreats while the other pursues, and over time, that pattern only creates more emotional distance between you two. What we're going to walk through here is what's actually happening underneath that pulling away behavior. You'll learn why blocking someone can quietly kill off emotional curiosity before it even has a chance to grow. You'll understand why begging destroys attraction far faster than silence ever could. And you'll see why emotional neutrality creates a psychological shift that catches most people completely off guard. You'll also come to understand the one calm, grounded response that genuinely changes how an avoidant person processes the entire connection without relying on pressure or manipulative games. Stick around until the end, because the final section reveals a psychological shift that can completely transform how you respond in these situations going forward. Let's start with blocking. In the moment, blocking an avoidant person might feel like you're taking back emotional control, but psychologically, it often produces the exact opposite effect. Instead of drawing them closer to you, it can actually slam shut a story that was still emotionally open and unresolved. Avoidant psychology reacts strongly to emotional certainty of any kind. The instant something becomes too clear, too final, too quickly, whatever emotional curiosity was still quietly active in the background tends to vanish completely. Here's something important to grasp. Avoidant individuals are remarkably sensitive to emotional pressure, even when that pressure is entirely indirect. When they start feeling overwhelmed within a connection, their natural instinct already leans toward creating distance just to regain some internal sense of control. But when blocking enters the picture, it often gets interpreted as a final emotional boundary, one that confirms their deepest internal fear all along. That closeness inevitably leads to emotional intensity, conflict, or a total loss of control. This rarely sparks genuine reflection in them. More often, it triggers emotional withdrawal and quiet acceptance that distance really is the safest path forward. There's another hidden effect at play here too. Blocking hands someone emotional closure far too easily, even if the avoidant person was still genuinely uncertain, still processing things internally, still thinking about you, still subtly attached in some quiet way. Blocking wipes out all of that ambiguity in an instant. And ambiguity, as strange as it sounds, is often exactly what keeps emotional curiosity alive within avoidant dynamics. The moment emotional access disappears entirely, their nervous system simply stops searching for connection altogether because it assumes the entire situation has already been fully resolved. This is precisely where most people misread avoidant behavior. They assume that closure will somehow spark emotional pursuit on the other end. But within avoidant psychology, too much closure delivered too quickly can actually end emotional engagement altogether. There's simply nothing left for their mind to question or process. So instead of moving toward the connection, their mind shifts away from it entirely. Blocking can also end up reinforcing an avoidant person's underlying fear of emotional pressure. Even when no pressure was actually intended on your part, the act itself can still feel like a kind of emotional finality delivered with real intensity behind it. And for someone who already associates closeness with emotional overwhelm, this only reinforces their existing pattern of retreating the moment emotional intensity starts climbing. Here's the piece most people completely overlook. Uncertainty plays an enormously powerful role in avoidant attachment. Not chaos, not drama, just calm, quiet emotional ambiguity. When something stays unresolved in a peaceful, non-threatening way, the mind naturally stays psychologically tethered to it. But the moment blocking removes that ambiguity entirely, the emotional loop often closes on their end too. Not because the feelings themselves disappeared, but because the emotional pathway connecting you two got shut down from the outside. Now, let's talk about begging, because it rarely, if ever, creates the closeness people are hoping for. In fact, it usually does the complete opposite. It increases distance, and not because the avoidant person doesn't feel anything at all, but because emotional desperation directly activates their strongest internal fear system. For avoidant individuals, emotional intensity that feels uncontrolled or overwhelming often gets processed internally as danger, not as genuine connection. The moment someone starts begging, the entire emotional energy of the interaction shifts almost instantly. The tone turns urgent, the emotional expectations become heavy and constant, the need for reassurance never seems to let up. And for an avoidant nervous system, this level of emotional pressure can feel genuinely suffocating, not in any physical sense, but psychologically. It creates this creeping sense that all available emotional space is disappearing fast. And whenever that emotional space starts vanishing, avoidant people instinctively move away in order to restore it. Neediness also taps into something even deeper within avoidant psychology, which is their underlying fear of emotional engulfment. This is essentially the fear of being emotionally consumed or trapped entirely inside someone else's emotional world. Even when the actual intention behind the begging comes from a place of love, reassurance, or a genuine desire for connection, the emotional experience on the avoidant side still registers as pressure rather than safety. And whenever that emotional pressure rises, withdrawal becomes their automatic go-to regulation response. There's another important shift happening on the attraction level too. Emotional chasing destroys the delicate balance that keeps emotional curiosity alive in the first place. Attraction within avoidant dynamics often depends heavily on emotional stability, a kind of calm unpredictability, and a genuine sense of emotional space. The moment one side starts chasing intensely, the entire dynamic becomes emotionally lopsided. The avoidant person no longer feels any real sense of emotional equality within the interaction, just a constant stream of emotional expectation directed squarely at them, and that imbalance slowly chips away at emotional engagement over time. Begging also strips away the emotional mystery that keeps an avoidant person's attention genuinely alive. When emotions get fully exposed without any restraint whatsoever, there's simply nothing left for them to interpret, observe, or slowly process on their own terms. From the outside, it might look like disconnection, indifference, or a loss of interest entirely. But internally, it's often a genuinely active process of emotional self-protection happening beneath the surface. The avoidant person may still feel attached to you, they may still think about the connection regularly, they may still care in quiet, subtle ways, but they step back because staying immersed in that same emotional intensity simply feels like too much for them to handle in that particular moment. There's another important layer to this psychology worth understanding. Distance allows avoidant individuals to reset their entire emotional state. When they're alone, the emotional pressure they've been carrying naturally decreases. Their nervous system gradually stabilizes. Their thoughts become noticeably less emotionally charged. And within that calmer state, they're finally able to reconnect with themselves again without feeling completely consumed by the relationship dynamic they've been navigating. This is exactly why avoidant people often disconnect in order to regain emotional control, not because they've genuinely stopped caring about you. The emotional bond may very well still exist underneath everything, but the sheer intensity of ongoing closeness simply becomes too much for their system to process continuously without a break. So, distance becomes a kind of emotional breathing room rather than an outright emotional rejection. And once that space successfully restores their internal balance, avoidant people will often reappear, reconnect, or re-engage in ways that genuinely confuse the people who assumed the distance meant the attachment had disappeared entirely. In reality, that attachment was very often still there the whole time, just temporarily paused while they worked to restore their own emotional stability. Now here's the first real shift that changes everything about navigating avoidant dynamics successfully, and it's not something you actually say to them at all. It's something you change within yourself instead. The moment you stop reacting emotionally to their behavior, the entire structure of the connection begins shifting in real time, because avoidant behavior is largely shaped and sustained by the emotional reactions surrounding it. When one person withdraws and the other immediately responds with panic, anger, or emotional pursuit, that cycle just keeps repeating itself without any real interruption. But the moment emotional reaction stops entirely, the whole pattern finally breaks apart. Stopping your emotional reaction means actively resisting the urge to respond immediately out of fear, confusion, or emotional urgency. It means refusing to let anxiety dictate how or when you communicate. It means deliberately creating space between what you're actually feeling internally and what you choose to express outwardly. Within avoidant dynamics specifically, this space carries real power because it introduces something completely unexpected into the entire system, genuine emotional stability instead of constant emotional escalation. The second major shift involves letting go of your need to chase emotional clarity. Most people caught in these situations feel this intense, almost desperate urge to understand absolutely everything right away. Why did they pull back? What did that behavior actually mean? What happens next between us? Where does the connection genuinely stand right now? But constantly searching for that kind of clarity tends to create more emotional pressure, not less. And within avoidant psychology specifically, pressure almost always leads to further withdrawal rather than deeper connection. When emotional clarity gets demanded too quickly or too forcefully, the entire dynamic starts feeling emotionally heavy. The avoidant person begins feeling overwhelmed all over again, and the whole cycle simply resets itself from scratch. But when clarity isn't actively chased, when space is genuinely allowed to exist instead, something entirely different starts happening internally. The emotional tension gradually loses its grip and intensity. The third shift involves letting go of the demand for immediate answers. This is honestly where most emotional imbalance originates in the first place. Urgency changes the emotional tone of every single interaction you have. It strips away calmness and replaces it with mounting pressure instead. And pressure happens to be exactly what avoidant systems are most sensitive to. When these three shifts start happening together, emotional silence begins entering the dynamic in a completely different way than before. Not as punishment, not as some manipulative tactic, but as genuine emotional regulation instead. And this particular kind of silence is what creates the very first real interruption within the avoidant cycle, because silence without any emotional chasing attached removes the predictable pattern they've grown accustomed to expecting. There's no immediate reaction waiting for them, no emotional escalation building up, no pressure response demanding anything from them. And this absence of reaction completely transforms the emotional environment they're used to navigating. Instead of feeding into the same old cycle, this kind of silence introduces uncertainty in a genuinely calm, non-threatening way. And within avoidant psychology, that particular shift is often what creates the very first moment of real reflection, replacing what would normally be automatic withdrawal instead. Emotional neutrality stands out as one of the most powerful shifts available within avoidant dynamics, because it completely transforms the emotional language underlying the entire interaction. Most avoidant cycles get built around emotional contrast. One person becomes anxious, reactive, or emotionally charged, while the other becomes distant, quiet, or completely withdrawn. This particular push and pull creates a pattern that both people eventually grow used to, even when it feels genuinely painful to live through repeatedly. But emotional neutrality interrupts that entire system the moment your responses become calm, steady, and emotionally balanced instead. Their nervous system stops receiving the usual emotional signals it's been conditioned to expect. There are no emotional highs signaling urgency anymore, no emotional lows signaling panic, no escalation forcing any kind of reaction out of them. Instead, the entire interaction starts feeling emotionally stable, and that stability fundamentally changes how the avoidant person perceives the connection internally. Calm, grounded responses reset emotional tension precisely because they don't add any fuel to the existing emotional cycle. Rather than increasing intensity, they actively reduce it instead. And within avoidant psychology, reduced emotional intensity typically gets interpreted as safety rather than as any kind of threat. Their nervous system genuinely begins settling down, simply because it's no longer being pulled into emotional pressure coming from your side of things. Emotional neutrality also removes the usual emotional hooks responsible for triggering reactive behavior in the first place. When someone stops over-explaining themselves, stops reacting dramatically to every little thing, and stops emotionally chasing after answers, the avoidant person no longer has a predictable emotional response available to rely on. This effectively breaks the automatic cycle of withdrawal, followed by pursuit, that usually defines the entire dynamic. Here's another important point worth clarifying. Emotional neutrality doesn't mean emotional coldness whatsoever. It's not some form of emotional shutdown, and it's definitely not a punishment tactic. It's simply the complete absence of emotional escalation. There's genuine presence without applying pressure. Real awareness without any sense of urgency attached. Actual communication without emotional overload weighing everything down. And this is exactly where the shift becomes genuinely significant on a psychological level. Emotional neutrality tends to feel unfamiliar to avoidant individuals precisely because it doesn't match the emotional patterns they've grown accustomed to experiencing within relationships. They're typically used to emotional intensity, followed by withdrawal, or emotional pressure, followed by sudden space. But neutrality simply doesn't fit neatly into either of those familiar categories. This unfamiliarity effectively breaks their expected pattern entirely. It creates a genuine pause within their emotional system. Instead of reacting automatically the way they always have, the avoidant person now has to process an entirely different emotional environment, one that doesn't demand anything from them, doesn't chase them, and doesn't escalate anything. And in a lot of cases, that particular pause becomes the very first moment where genuine reflection starts replacing their automatic emotional distancing instead. Because once emotional neutrality is genuinely present, the dynamic stops being driven purely by reaction. It becomes driven by real stability instead, and that stability changes absolutely everything happening beneath the surface. Absence carries a very specific psychological effect on avoidant individuals because their entire emotional system is highly sensitive to predictability and control. When emotional access remains constant, predictable, or always readily available, avoidant people often feel far less internal pressure to engage deeply with the connection. But the moment that emotional access becomes genuinely uncertain, something shifts within their attention system almost immediately. Their mind starts focusing more intensely on whatever is no longer predictable. Unpredictability naturally activates attention, simply because the brain is wired to prioritize things it can't fully understand or control. Within avoidant dynamics specifically, when someone stops reacting emotionally, stops chasing, and stops providing those constant emotional signals they've come to expect, the usual emotional pattern simply disappears. This absence creates a genuine gap where emotional certainty used to exist. And that particular gap forces their nervous system to become more alert, not less alert, as you might expect. Emotional access becoming uncertain represents a key psychological shift here. When the avoidant person is no longer sure exactly how emotionally available someone actually is, their mind begins reevaluating the entire connection in a completely different way. Instead of relying on the predictable emotional responses they've grown used to, they're left sitting with genuine emotional ambiguity instead. And ambiguity tends to trigger internal reflection precisely because the outcome is no longer guaranteed or certain. This is exactly where curiosity begins, quietly replacing avoidance. In typical avoidant cycles, emotional intensity coming from the other person usually leads directly to withdrawal, simply because it feels overwhelming to process. But emotional absence doesn't create that same kind of pressure. It creates distance without any demand attached to it, and that particular difference turns out to be absolutely crucial. Without emotional pressure weighing things down, their nervous system stops reacting defensively the way it normally would. Instead, it actually starts observing the situation more carefully. Silence genuinely works better than direct emotional confrontation within these particular dynamics, mainly because confrontation tends to increase emotional pressure significantly. It forces an immediate reaction, triggers defensiveness, or pushes someone straight into withdrawal. But silence removes emotional escalation from the equation entirely. It doesn't demand answers from anyone, and it doesn't create emotional overload either. Instead, it introduces genuine space where the avoidant person can process everything internally without feeling emotionally cornered in the process. This particular space is exactly where curiosity naturally begins to form. When emotional certainty disappears, but the emotional connection itself hasn't been completely severed, their mind starts genuinely questioning the shift that's occurred. What actually changed here? Why does this feel different now? Why isn't emotional access automatic anymore the way it used to be? And within avoidant psychology, these unanswered questions often generate far more internal attention than any emotional argument ever could. Because silence doesn't actively push an avoidant person away from you. It simply changes the emotional environment they've become accustomed to navigating, and once that environment stops behaving predictably, curiosity naturally starts replacing avoidance beneath the surface. So, what's the one thing you should actually do differently within these avoidant dynamics? It's not really a reaction, a calculated strategy, or some emotional move specifically designed to trigger a response from them. It's a genuine shift in your own emotional positioning instead. This shift begins the exact moment you step back emotionally, not out of anger or as some form of punishment, but out of genuine self-awareness. This step back creates crucial space between emotional impulse and emotional action, and that space fundamentally changes how the entire dynamic unfolds from that point forward. Stepping back emotionally simply means you no longer allow your immediate feelings to control every response you give. It's the exact moment you stop reacting purely out of fear, confusion, or emotional urgency. Instead of desperately trying to fix the situation instantly, you allow that emotional energy to naturally settle first. This effectively prevents the cycle of emotional escalation that usually keeps avoidant dynamics feeling so unstable and chaotic. Staying calm and consistent represents the next layer of this entire shift. Calmness isn't the same thing as indifference. It's genuine emotional regulation instead. It means your tone, your responses, and your overall behavior remain steady even when the situation itself feels genuinely uncertain. Consistency creates real emotional predictability through your behavior, but without any emotional pressure attached to it. And this particular balance is exactly what disrupts the usual push and pull cycle that's been playing out. Removing emotional urgency represents another absolutely critical piece of this puzzle. Urgency creates pressure. Pressure creates withdrawal. Once urgency gets removed from the equation, the entire emotional environment starts shifting. There's no more chasing happening, no demanding, no requirement for any immediate emotional reaction. This significantly reduces the internal tension that typically drives avoidant distancing behavior in the first place. The final piece of this puzzle involves focusing on your own self-stability. This is genuinely where the real transformation happens. Instead of centering all your emotional energy around the other person's behavior, your attention shifts back toward your own emotional grounding instead. Your daily routines, your own thoughts, your personal emotional balance. Your internal stability becomes the actual priority here, rather than constantly reacting to external uncertainty coming from them. And this is exactly where the real shift genuinely begins, because once emotional control returns fully to you, the entire dynamic changes at its very core. The interaction stops being driven by emotional reactivity altogether. It's no longer shaped by fear or by constant pursuit. It becomes influenced by calm, grounded presence instead of emotional chaos. Avoidant individuals respond very differently to emotional environments that no longer feel reactive or pressured, not because they're being manipulated in any way, but because the emotional system they've grown used to simply doesn't exist in the same form anymore. And once that familiar cycle disappears, the entire dynamic naturally begins shifting in ways that simply weren't possible before. Control was genuinely never rooted in their behavior. It was never hidden in their silence, their distance, or their unpredictability either. The real control was always found in the emotional response that followed on your end, because every single reaction, every emotional chase, every moment of frustration or urgency quietly shaped the direction of the connection, far more than the avoidant person ever did on their own. The real power was never really about blocking or begging in the first place. Both of those reactions stem from raw emotional intensity, and emotional intensity happens to be exactly what keeps avoidant dynamics active and unresolved. One person pushes forward, while the other pulls away, and the cycle simply continues on without any real change. It feels like meaningful action in the moment, but it usually just creates more emotional imbalance rather than any genuine resolution. It was always fundamentally about emotional control, not control over them, but control over yourself instead. Control over your own reactions, control over your urgency, control over that constant need for immediate answers or emotional certainty, because once that internal pressure genuinely reduces, the entire emotional structure of the dynamic naturally starts to shift. When you finally stop reacting emotionally, you stop feeding the cycle that depends entirely on emotional escalation to survive. The push and pull gradually weakens, the predictability of your reactions disappears completely, and the emotional system simply stops functioning the way it used to. That's precisely when something genuinely different starts happening beneath the surface. Silence transforms into space instead of conflict. Distance transforms into reflection instead of outright rejection. And emotional uncertainty slowly starts losing its grip and power over your internal state. That's the exact moment real emotional change begins forming naturally, without any forcing, chasing, or emotional struggle involved. And in a lot of cases, that particular shift is what ends up changing everything, because once emotional reactivity finally ends, the dynamic stops running on those same old patterns entirely. It begins resetting itself in ways that might feel unfamiliar at first, but are genuinely necessary for real emotional clarity and self-respect moving forward.